So the recording has begun. Welcome, everybody. I am David Kramer. I'm director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and it brings me both personally and professionally great pleasure to bring Judith Hauptman to talk about her most recent book. Judy and I are friends and colleagues going back for years. We sat around the same table many times discussing politics and policy at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Is that a fair way to describe it, Judy?
Yes, yeah.
And we miss her. So, you know, it's just so wonderful to have you back and involved in this. It seems, I mean, first of all, I want to say this is quite remarkable to watch you say hello to everybody, to greet people. You are more present as a speaker to those beforehand than any of our authors have ever been. And I commend you for that. I think it helps make everybody feel very comfortable. And I suspect, given the way you were going around, that you know a lot of people who are here. So, you know, for those of you who know Judy, I don't need to say very much. For those of you who don't, I will just add that Judy was an important professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary, doing groundbreaking work in a variety of ways, not least her work on women in the Talmud and in rabbinic religion. And we are all, in that way, her students. Talk about students and teacher. She is very well known amongst the generations of our students for her exceptional teaching. And one of the things you will find when you open up this new book is that it features Judy in really teaching mode. I mean, she introduces us to text, she leads us through texts, and it's just a wonderful way to engage these texts with you as teacher. It sort of reminded me of, you know, the way we have Rashi by our side when we're trying to make sense of a Gemara. So here it's not Judy, excuse me, it is Judy. It's not Rashi, and we're grateful for that. Okay, so I'll just pass the baton here. I'm gonna highlight you, spotlight you to be more correct for Zoom so that everyone can see you. And yes, everybody, please keep yourselves on mute. If you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat at any time, but we will leave them to the last 15 minutes approximately, at which point I will call, you know, choose among the questions, put some together, and I'll read them to you, Judy, so you'll have a chance to respond. Okay? Again,
Yes,
welcome to everybody.
I have one technical question. It would be better for me if
Yes.
The chat was only to you and not that people could not chat each other during my talk, because that's very distracting. Or if that's
okay, so you know what? Let's just ask. I don't know if I can set it that way. I'll try. But in any case, if people will hold your chatting, you know, just send it directly to me. Or wait till the end. Those are the two options. Okay. So there you are, Judy. You should be on screen for everybody. And when you share your screen, you will be the only one we see on the side of what you're sharing. Okay.
All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted you're here. This is a book talk. This is what my brand new book that officially was published in September, what it looks like. I'm not going to do this later, so I'll say it right now. If you're interested in purchasing it, of course, don't even consider doing that until you hear a little bit about it from me tonight. But if you are interested in purchasing it, do not go to Amazon because they are charging $70. The official list price on the Gorgias Press website is $55, but they're selling it right now at 20% discount at $44. It's been that way for a while. I don't know how much longer the $44 price will last. It's only in hardcover. You don't have choices between hard and soft. So that's the book. Okay, I'm going to begin this session with one short anecdote from the Talmud. I'm now going to share my screen so you can see the text itself. All right, I think we're good, David, yes? My screen is shared.
Yes, it is shared. It's very clear.
Oh, okay, but there's a problem right now because This is the fourth one, and I want to go back to the first one.
You should be able to manipulate it on your screen. You just use your cursor the way you ordinarily would.
I'm trying to, but it's not listening to me. Oh, there we go.
There you go.
That's it. Okay. So the first anecdote is on the topic of the holiday of Sukkot. I'm going to read it in Hebrew and translate it and comment on it. So I begin with the Mishnah. Kol shivat hayamim adam oseh sukkato keva. For the 7 days of the holiday, a person should make his sukkah his permanent place of dwelling, ubeito arai, and his home his temporary place of dwelling. Everything shifts to the opposite mode. Yordu v'shamim, this is the point of you'll see in the anecdote. If it starts to rain on the holiday of Sukkot, me'imatai mutar lefanot, from when is it permissible to leave the sukkah and dwell, eat, sleep in your home? Misha tisrach hamikpah, from the time when the mikpah spoils. Mikpah is from the root kafu, which means to be frozen or to be gelled. So in other words, if the rain falls into the soup and you're in the sukkah, you're not allowed to go into the house. But if you were serving a mousse or a jello or a kugel, and enough rain spoils the texture of the food that you're serving or eating in the sukkah, then you have permission of the Mishnah to move into the house. That's the Mishnah. And now I go down to the Gemara. Okay, this is the commentary on the Mishnah. It's only on the comment. The comment is only on the words Yordu Geshamim, if it rains. Okay, there's a very short teaching here. I'll just read in English. A Tannaitic text says from the time that a pounded grain dish spoils. So my example of pounded grain was potato kugel or something along those lines. But now we come to an anecdote. There's going to be a verbal exchange. There are going to be two rabbis, two very well-known rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud, talking to each other. Abaye havakayativ kamed Rav Yosef b'mitalalta. So that last word in Hebrew, it's actually Aramaic, comes from the word shade, sail, although here it's tet lamed as opposed to tzadi lamed. So a sukkah offers shade. So Abaye, prominent rabbi in the Talmud, is sitting before his mentor, Rav Yosef. So at this point in time, Abaye is a student, or we should say a junior scholar, in the presence of Rav Yosef, a senior scholar, his mentor. Nashav zika, a wind blows, kamaite tzibuta, and the wind brings down chips of schach, of wood, something comes down into the food. Anybody who's had a meal in the JTS Sukkah, certainly before the pandemic, maybe even during the pandemic, I can't say, there are pine needles or whatever, evergreen needles in the food and on the trays all the time. It doesn't bother me, but you'll see what happens here. So these two rabbis are in a sukkah, and it's also interesting that on the holiday of Sukkot, the student is eating with his teacher in the sukkah, because students in those days, as I say, junior scholars, students, whatever you want to call them, they were with their masters kind of around the clock. And perhaps, according to Catherine Hesher, in exchange for tuition, they did household chores such as serving a meal or attending a meal and so on. So what happens now that we've got chips falling into the food? Amar lahu Rav Yosef, the mentor and the senior scholar, says to them, the them is not clear. It could be his household servants. It could be several students of his. I can't say for sure. But he says, Panuli mane mehacha, remove the utensils, meaning take the platters of food from here, meaning bring them into the house. Amar le Abaye. Now, you should already be saying something in your head that something is wrong here. Amar le Abaye. So Abaye, upon hearing his teacher say, let's eat in the house, Abaye says to him, "B'hatznan misha tisracha mikpah." But doesn't the Mishnah say only when a sufficient amount of rain falls that it ruins the gelled food, that's when you're allowed to go into the house? What's happened so far? A wind is blowing and there are some chips falling down. He is criticizing his teacher. He's calling out his teacher. Again, I use teacher, senior scholar, all the same. He's calling him out. Abaye is calling out Rav Yosef and saying, you're violating the rule of the Mishnah. You're moving into the house much too soon. How can you defend your action? Amar le, end of the anecdote, lididi, he says, according to me, Rav Yosef says, according to me, kevan, or for me, kevan da'anina data I have to move down 1 second. Kevan da'anina datai kamisha tisracha mikpah damili. So Rav Yosef says, for me, chips falling down into the food before the rain falls, for me, that's equivalent to rain spoiling the gelled food. In other words, he's carving out an exception for himself. Rav Yosef is saying, yes, the Mishnah clearly states that the rain has to begin before you move into the house, and not just begin, but a sufficient amount of rain has to fall for the food to, lose its flavor, lose its texture. Then you can move into the house. And he's saying, I have a new way of understanding the Mishnah. This Mishnah doesn't literally mean enough rain has to ruin the food. It means when I am sufficiently uncomfortable, as if I'm feeling now the same way I would feel if the gel food was spoiled, that's allowing me to move into the house. Now, let me just point out, the Mishnah said nothing of the sort. The Mishnah laid out a blanket rule. This is when you move into the house after sufficient amount of rain falls. And Abaye, who's a sharp student, and by the way, when students challenge teachers, this is a little bit of an aside right now, when students challenge teachers, that is their role. They are not being impertinent. They are not being disrespectful. I must say, David and I am sure when we prepared an article for publication or writing a book, we like to give it to our students or to colleagues for them to tell us where are the holes in our logic. So the role of a student is expected to help a teacher think things through, just in case you're worried about that. Okay, but now I'm coming back to Abaye. Abaye understands the Mishnah as not allowing a person to move into the house before the rain falls, only after the rain begins. So please don't say to me, oh, that's what the Mishnah meant to begin with, that, oh, rain falling, ruining food. Well, it's very subjective, it's very relative, you can stretch it out and so on. No. Abaye is saying the Mishnah literally means from when the gel food spoils, or I'll just say more loosely, after the rain starts. And Rav Yosef moved into the house or gave orders to move into the house before the rain started to fall. So when Rav Yosef says, oh, I'm fastidious, that's how I translated anin da'at. It's in Aramaic, it's also in Hebrew. That is, okay, there are two possibilities here. Either Rav Yosef on the spot is producing this exception to the rule of the Mishnah, which is very, shall I say, self-serving. Either he's doing that on the spot because Abaye criticized him, or, and I don't have an answer to this, another possibility is that this has been his thought out opinion, his considered opinion for some time now. It just happened that in this particular case, Abaye saw him exercising his well thought out opinion that you don't have to take food spoiling literally. It means when you're uncomfortable, even before the rain falls, you can move into the house. I am still saying that what we see here, it's a brief anecdote. Okay, it's 4 lines actually. I have shorter ones coming up, 4 sections, the way I put it out on the screen here. It has 4 sections, but the outcome is that a senior rabbi, in this case Rav Yosef, has changed the rule of the Mishnah, meaning, oh, for most people, you don't move into the house until enough rain falls to ruin the food. But for people like me, who are anine da'at, we could move into the house earlier. I call that an adaptation, a modification of the rule of the Mishnah. All right, this is just to give you a sense of the kinds of materials that I talk about in my book. Okay, having brought you into this discussion in this way, I'm now going to, I'm going to leave the screen share on because I'm going to make some comments, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, and then we'll return to more examples on the screen share. Although, let me just see. David, would it be better if I go off screen share for a while?
I think that way people will be able to see your face better.
Yes, let me do that. I'll do stop share. Okay. I'm on stop share. So here are my introductory remarks to the rest of the topics, the rest of the sugya for tonight. So when we think of Talmud, if I just say to somebody, what does Talmud mean to you? Usually what comes to mind are rules of Jewish practice, debates, teachings based on biblical verses, and even long stories about rabbis. And, you know, just to mention one of the famous ones, Oven Avachdai. But there are also short stories, or what I'm calling what we just did, an anecdote as opposed to a story. These anecdotes show you how a certain rabbi performed a halakhah, and these short stories usually appear at the end of a sugya. Sugya is a discussion unit in the Talmud. These little stories that I'm talking about are not so interesting. Now, I'm hoping that you found the anecdote that we just looked at very interesting, okay? But in many cases, especially when there's no dialogue, some of these anecdotes, they're really two different categories. There are the anecdotes with no verbal exchange, just Rabbi X did so-and-so, period, like 5 words. We'll see one of those. And then there are the anecdotes like the one we just looked at, where there's a verbal exchange, and that is more interesting. But I'm just gonna say, as a group, these anecdotes, be they the short ones, the very short ones, or the slightly longer ones with some Amoraic exchange of rabbis, they're not as interesting as those long stories. So people don't pay a lot of attention to them. And I began to, okay, and that led me to this book, of course. So our assumption, generally speaking, is that the Talmud, originally an orally transmitted document, where we assume that the Talmud utilized the principle of economy of language. In other words, say it in fewer words or include fewer statements rather than more, because to burden a memory with anything that was not worthwhile would be a shame. So that's what we usually assume. And I'm not in any way challenging that. But the question is, whoever edited the Talmud, and many people have weighed in on that, I'm not gonna weigh in on that at the moment, but why did the editors of the Talmud include these short anecdotes? They number in the hundreds, possibly thousands. What do they come to say? What do they come to teach us? I think you already know where I'm heading, but I'm allowed to ask that question as if we have not yet looked at any examples. The traditional answer as to why these little anecdotes appear in the Talmud, why they were included by the editor, the traditional answer is, oh, these anecdotes, they show how rabbis back then meticulously carried out the law, how pious they were, what good role models they are for us today. Now, I accepted that theory for a long time until I began to notice quite a few years ago that if you look closely at these short anecdotes, they seem to show an Amora, I'll define that word shortly, it's a rabbi. They seem to show a rabbi carrying out a previously stated law, but at the same time that he is carrying it out, he is changing it in minor and sometimes even major ways. By the way, let me just add, I'm not the first person to write about narratives in the Talmud. There are a couple of excellent books that have come out in the last couple of years. But although these books capture things that are very interesting and very important, rabbis seeking to show that they have the authority to change Jewish law, figuring out cultural discourse and so on. These are very nice books about narratives, usually longer narratives, sometimes shorter narratives. None of them talks about what I'm talking about tonight, which is the halachic modification that we see in these anecdotes. So I am claiming that if you start turning the pages of the Talmud and you come across an anecdote, you know, at the end of a discussion, or sometimes in the middle of a discussion, Rabbi so-and-so did such and such, and if you compare what the anecdote describes about how the rabbi carried out the rule to what the rule said, the rabbi who's carrying out the law lives later than the rabbi who formulated the law. In other words, somebody formulates the law, it goes out to the people, people observe it, let's say, and then at a later time, 50 years, 100 years, I cannot say, another rabbi comes along and performs it in a slightly different way. And to my mind, that is the message of these anecdotes, because most of us think that the Talmud and later Jewish law codes, we think that their central point is that halakhah, Jewish law, is not open to change, the immutability of halakhah. And I'm suggesting that these short anecdotes are telling us that Shabbat and holidays and prayer and marriage law, all of these topics are up for change over time. That is the core point of my new volume. Yes, and the thing that I have written down here is, when these anecdotes, which I'm claiming are bringing about modifications or modifying Jewish law, the rabbis are not formulating a statement of change. They are simply behaving differently from the way the law was prescribed, with the way the law prescribes. What I'm trying to say is the actions of a rabbi, so to speak even louder than words. A short anecdote, it's called ma'aseh rav. An anecdote, a ma'aseh is rav, is greater than just an opinion. So although my friends who have looked at this, my colleagues who have looked at my manuscript, they are not allowing me to say what I'm going to say right now, but they've nixed this, that because the anecdotes appear at the end of a sugya, almost always, not always, but most of the time, I wanted to claim in an earlier version of my manuscript that the point of them coming at the end is that they have the last word on the halakhah that's being discussed. But my colleague said to me, no, anecdotes just appear at the end. You can't draw any conclusions from there. So I bowed to my colleagues' opinions. I did not put that in my book, but I'm actually daring to say it to you right now. I still think I'm right. I just don't have evidence for what I'm telling you. So you can think of what you want. Okay, I have to say a couple more things about the Talmud before we get back to the anecdotes. I see time is passing. So let me just say one more thing about the Talmud. Many of us Talmudists have come around in the last, 20, 30 years to the theory of the Talmud growing in layers, that the Talmud was not composed line by line by line, kind of vertically. First, the rabbi said this, and the next rabbi said that. And, over the generations, the discussions kept getting longer and longer. No, we think, many of us, not everybody, the majority of us are saying the following, that the oldest layer of the Talmud is what we call the Tannaitic layer. Yes, there is the Mishnah, that is rabbis who lived before the year 200. Mishnah came out orally, apparently, in the year 200 Common Era. But then, after that, the first layer of the Talmud was to start adding Tannaitic teachings not included in the Mishnah, to associate them with the Mishnah. Those are called Breitot, external teachings, teaching outside the Mishnah. That's kind of the first layer. I'm not going to say anything more about that tonight. The second layer of the Talmud is composed, there are three altogether. The second layer of the Talmud is composed of Amoraic statements and Amoraic performances. What I mean by that is a rabbi who lived after the publication of the Mishnah, after the year 200, and more or less, there's a lot of disagreement here, I'll take a stab, more or less between 200 Common Era and 550 Common Era, those rabbis are called, in singular, Amora, or plural is Amoraim. So there's an Amoraic layer to the Talmud. That's the layer I'm interested in, because these Amoraim, they comment on the Mishnah, and they comment on the associated Tannaitic teachings to the Mishnah, the Breitot. They produce new laws. They learn things from biblical verses. My favorite part of the Talmud, I guess I have to say, is the Amoraic layer. And of course, these anecdotes about how Rabbi so-and-so carried out a halakhah, those anecdotes are part of the Amoraic layer. And the last thing I'll say about that is, generally speaking, it's a student who observed his mentor behaving in a certain way, who reported it, and then one way or another, the report was interpolated, inserted into the growing Talmud. And the last layer, which I'm not going to touch upon, is called the stam, the anonymous layer. I won't say any more about it now because it won't come up in tonight's discussion. So having said all of that, I now want to, so the anecdotes that I'm talking about are part of, are elements of, they constitute part of the Amoraic layer of the Talmud. And my conclusion tonight, my observation in my book is that I cannot talk about the anonymous layer, how it might have changed what the Amoraim were doing. That's lots of other people are looking into that. I am interested in these Amoraic anecdotes, how rabbis who carried out the law after the law had been formulated sometime earlier, how when they carried it out in anecdote after anecdote after anecdote, they modify the law. To me, that is a very exciting observation because it reverses the notion of the immutability of halakhah and is saying that the Talmud itself, this is what's important to me. It's not just a conservative rabbi like me, but the Talmud itself is saying over time, laws may need to be modified. Not every law has to be modified. Not every modification is going to be accepted. But the mechanism for change, which is an Amora who carries out an earlier stated halakhah a little differently from the way it was stated, that is a built-in mechanism for change in the Talmud, in the Amoraic layer. And I believe that in this volume, in which I have 80 anecdotes that I analyze, grouped in various ways and so on, I believe that I have demonstrated sufficiently well to convince the reader that I am right. Okay, none of that is as important now as looking at the anecdotes themselves. I'm going to share a screen. I think it's right there. And let's hope, yes, now I just have to go to the next. Okay, it's always hard in the beginning. There we go, number 2. Okay, here's the second anecdote. It begins with a Tannaitic teaching. It's not a Mishnah, it's what we call a Breita. You may purchase from women woolen garments in Judea, that region of Israel, around Jerusalem. You can purchase from them. But I'll read the English, but not wine or oil or fine flour, because the women, if they are selling you these products in Judea, they would likely be selling off their husband's goods without his consent. Abba Shaul, I'm going back to the Hebrew. Abba Shaul Omer Mocheret Isha ba'arba'a v'chamisha dinar. This is charming. Kedei lasot kippah l'rosha. I happen to love to talk about this line. He says, a woman can sell from the door of her home, small. She can sell an item for 4 dinars, 5 dinars. I don't know how much a dinar is, but I would say it's more or less like $1. And yeah, she's not going to sell, large amounts, but she can have a little cottage industry. She can make something and sell it at the door of her home. Why? Kedei lasot kippah l'rosha, to make herself a kippah. So you're all supposed to jump out of your seats right now and say, what? A woman in the time of this is the contemporaneous with the Mishnah, 200 Common Era, women back then were wearing kippot? And the answer is yes, but not the kind of, knitted kippah or velvet or suede kippah that we have today that usually adorn the heads of men. Women made themselves skull caps, okay? And what I like to point out, I can still remember my mother going to a millinery shop with me as a little girl tagging along, and you begin in the millinery shop with something that hugs the head, and then you add a feather or a flower or a piece of, a jewel, a pearl, whatever. And that apparently is what is being said here. Why do women want to sell products, handiwork of their own at the door of their homes? So that they can have little pocket money to buy themselves a new kippah. So I just like that women were wearing kippot before men were wearing kippot. Okay, that's a throwaway line. Now we come to the issue. Still talking about women. Charity collectors may accept from women davar mu'at, a small donation, avlo davar merubeh, but not a large donation. Again, the logic, if she gives a lot of money, she's giving away her husband's money and not her own. Okay, and now we get to this anecdote. Again, there's going to be verbal exchange. Ravina ikla leve machoza. And by the way, I always put in parentheses the generation of the rabbi. So Ravina is a Babylonian Mohr of the 7th generation. That's very late. And you see the next rabbi is even later. So this rabbi arrives in a well-known city in Babylonia, Machoza, Atunashe deve Machoza, and the women of this town, city, village, no, not a village, it's big, okay. Ramu Kameh, they throw at him, probably at his feet, Kavle Bashire, chains and bracelets, meaning he apparently pitched his charity so effectively that the women don't have cash on them, they started taking off their, it says chains and bracelets, I could say earrings, whatever. They started throwing valuable jewelry at this charity collector named Ravina. Amrale Rabba Tosefta Ravina. So Rabba Tosefta, who's junior to Ravina, again, fulfills the role of criticizing or challenging. He says to his senior scholar there, Vahatanya, didn't we learn in a Braita what we just learned? Meaning, how can you, Ravina, accept chains and bracelets from women, assuming they are made of silver or gold, maybe even coral is valuable back then? How can you accept these things? Don't you know the teaching that we both should know, which is you can only accept small donations from women and not large donations, and their jewelry is a large donation. Now, if you are a charity collector and you're being told to return the money that you just collected, which apparently is a considerable amount, that's the last thing that you want to do. So he's going to justify what he just did. Amarle, last line, Hane livnei machoza davar mu'at ninhu. So Ravina responds to his student, for the people of Machoza, these are small donations. Even for the women, let's say, they're the ones who gave the money. For the women of Machoza, these are small donations. So you see what he did? He took the words of the Braita, do not accept a big donation, davar merubeh. You may accept a small donation, davar mu'at, which in the teaching, in the Tannaitic teaching, in the Braita, was talking about absolute amounts. Now, what shall we say? Up to 25 dinar is small, more than 25 dinar is large. I'm just making that up, I don't know. But what the senior scholar is doing right now, he's saying, hey, it's relative, it's not absolute, okay? It's like if you go to the Upper East Side and the women want to give you $1,000 for your charity, apparently you can accept it. If you go to a neighborhood, without insulting anybody, but the Lower East Side, you know, used to be push carts and all that. Forgive me, Marcia, but if you go to the Lower East Side, you cannot accept a donation of $1,000 because you've got to assume that down there, if she's giving you $1,000, she's giving you her husband's money because she doesn't have access to that kind of money, okay? So again, I happen to like this sugya very much. It teaches us something that women, let me say it right now before I forget. Women are generous, all right? This rabbi comes into town, whether they knew him or not, I can't say, but he's not local because ikla means he dropped in. He was living somewhere else. He was traveling through, probably going from town to town, collecting for whatever charity, and we don't know which one. And what do the women do? They show up at the parlor meeting and they take out their checkbooks and are generous with their donations. So I love what this says about women. And by the way, elsewhere, the women of Machoza and other parts of the Talmud are criticized for being pampered and lazy. Oh, okay, you want to call them pampered and lazy? Maybe you can, and that's, I think, a biased comment. But this is the place where you really ought to pay attention to the nature of the women of Machoza. They are generous. They listen to what's being said, and they respond very appropriately for them. So the question, of course, is, Ravina, did he change the law when he said, oh, it's relative and I'm going to take large donations from these women because they're rich? For them, it's only a small donation. Did he change the law, or are you going to say that's what it meant to begin with? No, I'm not going to say that's what it meant to begin with, because the junior scholar challenges him with that line of the Braita saying, how can you do this? You're violating the rule of the earlier rule of the Braita, of the Tannaitic teaching. And it seems to me, again, My colleagues did not allow me to put this in the book. It's only a theory of mine. I think that on the spot, because his student caught him doing something in violation of the Breita, although he is, doing the right thing, so to speak, he's effective and he gets money from them to give away to charity. But he reinterprets the Breita on the spot, I think, in a way that serves his purposes, which is, don't think the Breita meant absolute amounts, it meant relative amounts. To me, this is a brand new way of interpreting the Breita. It was not meant by the author of the Breita, or it doesn't seem to have been meant that way, or certainly Rabbi Tosefta didn't understand the Breita to be saying that. And here is a very appealing, if you ask me, modification of the law. Okay, I go on to the next anecdote. This one is a little bit more complicated. Ula is a well-known he's a member of the Nechute. These are the people who travel back and forth from the land of Israel to Babylonia and, the very primitive telecommunication system. So he would bring the teachings of the Jerusalem rabbis, it's not exactly Jerusalem Talmud, the rabbis in the land of Israel, he would bring their teachings to Babylonia, and he would bring the Babylonian teachings back to the rabbis in the land of Israel. And by the way, these rabbis, see, this is a word that's very interesting to me. The second word in the Hebrew, it's actually Aramaic, ikla, means he dropped in on. Kuf lamed aleph is to, like a slingshot, to shoot a stone, but it also means to drop in on, the way a stone has a flight in the air and then it comes down. So Ula, apparently unannounced, because you could do that back then, he comes from the land of Israel and he drops in on Rav Menashe, I don't know much about him, and spends Shabbat there. Atahu gavra taraf ababa. And while Ula is spending Shabbat, Ula from Israel is spending Shabbat at the home of Rav Menashe, a certain man comes, nameless person, taraf ababa, and he knocks on the door on Shabbat. Amar, so Ula says, man hai, what's going on here? And then he curses him. Litchal gufe deka machile l'shabta. Litchal and machil both have the root of l'chalel, to desecrate. May his body be desecrated because he has desecrated the Sabbath. It is clear that according to Ula, you may not knock on a door on Shabbat, meaning in general, you may not produce noise of any sort on Shabbat. Now, Rav Menashe is silent, so I have no idea what Rav Menashe makes of any of this, but Amar le Rabbah, so Rabbah apparently is visiting or lives in this town, I don't know, and he's present, and Rabbah says to Ula, lo asru ela kol shel shir, only the sound of music. Okay, shir, you might say, oh, that's song, that's poetry, but I just like to call it sound of music. And Rabbah says, wait a second, Ula, you've got it wrong. The only forbidden sounds that a person may not produce on the Sabbath are sounds of music, meaning, of course, it's allowed to knock on a door on the Sabbath. Now, where do I see halachic modification here? According to the Jerusalem Talmud, a very clear statement, know what, kol mashmi'e kol asrim b'Shabbat, anything that produces a sound is forbidden on Shabbat. And throughout the generations, the Jerusalem Talmud rabbis debate this back and forth. It's pretty clear to me that in Babylonia, also, there seems to have been what seems to have been true in Babylonia is a ban on producing sounds on the Sabbath. But Rabbah does, to my mind, an amazing thing here. He is limiting, significantly limiting, and saying, as far as making sounds on the Sabbath, no musical instruments. Kol shel shir, cannot play musical instruments on Shabbat, but knocking on a gate, banging on a table, moving a chair, and so on, all of these kinds of sounds are allowed on Shabbat. Was there tension, halachic tension, between the rabbis of the land of Israel and the rabbis in Babylonia? Yes, there was. So it's rather clear to me that Rabbah on the spot is saying to Ula, here in Babylonia, we do things a little differently. We're more lenient, we're more liberal, and we allow knocking on the gate on Shabbat. And of course, it's understood that he's upset or angry that Ulla cursed this innocent Babylonian man who was knocking on a door on Shabbat, because that is perfectly allowed in Babylonia. So yes, I do see halachic modification here. Now, let me see. It is now 8:12, and I have this last example. I'm going to talk it through very, very fast. So the Mishnah says on Yom Kippur, there are a lot of things that are forbidden. No eating, drinking, bathing, anointing body, and no wearing sandals or shoes. I underlined it in Hebrew, nilata sandal. Sandal, it refers either to sandals, which are straps on a sole, or shoes, which have more covering. Basically, what the Mishnah is saying is you have to go barefoot on Yom Kippur, because the model here is the model of mourning. I know you can eat and drink when you mourn, but there's no bathing and no anointing and no engaging in sexual relations. The general model for how to behave on a public fast day is an adapted model of mourning rituals. So go barefoot. Then we have, this is 4 very brief anecdotes. They're either 4 words or 3 words or 6 words. But what happens here, I'm just going to read the English. Rav Judah, and we go down the generations, BA2, BA4, BA4. BA3 comes at the end because it's longer. They usually organize these anecdotes either in chronological order, but if something is much longer, it'll go last. Rav Judah went forth in footgear made of reeds on Yom Kippur. Abaya went forth in footgear made of palm branches of Yom Kippur. Rava went forth in footgear made of twisted reeds on Yom Kippur. Rabba bar Rav Huna tied a piece of cloth around his legs and went forth on Yom Kippur. What I am claiming here is that in Babylonia, the people who went barefoot were slaves, or people of lower social class, or people who were too poor to own a pair of shoes. These rabbis did not want to go barefoot on this special day, this holy day of Yom Kippur, or even any other public fast day. So instead of going barefoot, they make themselves footgear that you cannot qualify as a sandal or a shoe. And what they're saying is, I'm going barefoot, that I wrap a piece of cloth around my legs, I'm still going barefoot. I'm not wearing shoes. I'm going barefoot. And similarly with the reeds and palm branches and so on. So it seems to me that here we have a very interesting example of change for the purpose of, I don't know, social concerns. Rabbis didn't want to go out in public on Yom Kippur barefoot. I can understand that. I'm not sure I would want to go out barefoot. Not because it's not safe in New York City to go out barefoot, but it's just inappropriate. We cover our feet, even if sandals are somewhat revealing, but still, we don't go out barefoot. So for comfort or for safety or for social status reasons, these rabbis basically said, the Mishnah wants me to go barefoot. King David went barefoot when he ascended the Mount of Olives, when he was mourning his son Avshalom. I'm not going barefoot. Or yes, I will go barefoot, but when I put on something made of reeds, I'm still going barefoot. That's not a shoe. A shoe is made of leather, but I'm going out in footgear made of reeds. So here we have 4 little anecdotes. With this I am ending. Here we have 4 very short anecdotes in which there's no verbal exchange, no junior rabbi criticizing a more senior rabbi, no senior rabbi defending himself. But this is a case of multiple anecdotes all commenting on the same halakha of the Mishnah. And I think when you see multiple anecdotes, I have a whole chapter on this, you're being told by the Talmud, there's more than one way to go about doing it. And if you want to wear a Crocs on Yom Kippur, that too is okay. It doesn't have to be reeds or branches or whatever these rabbis did. You've got 4 different approaches, 4 different means of four different means of fulfilling the rule of going barefoot, because in their head, they're going barefoot. You too could do that. I'm just trying to think, can we say Crocs will fit the bill? Maybe not. I'm not here to issue a halachic statement. I'm just trying to help you understand what's going on. So I'm now just saying my bottom line is, I come across these anecdotes as I read the Talmud, and each time I come across one, I say, what is happening here? And almost invariably, there are going to be exceptions, right? But almost invariably, when I compare what's happening in the anecdote to the earlier stated halakhah, I see that there's been some modification. I rest my case, and the floor is open to questions and comments.
I will express the questions. Judy, if you can unshare your screen.
Oh, yeah.
So that
Yes, of
people can
course.
see you.
I'm going to stop share. Okay.
Yes, good. Okay, great. So one listener wants to know whether you see the stories as serving essentially the same function as final opinions that might be expressed as a simple teaching, or do the anecdotes have a different function or a different dynamic? And if so, what would it be?
Okay, I think I understand that question. Yes, in other words, rather than formulate the change in law as no longer do we have to go barefoot, we can wear anything, not made of leather on Yom Kippur, I think rabbis understand that just to go and do it and let people observe and let students then report about it is at least as effective, if not more effective, than just stating it out like that. But my final comment on this would be, if you go to the Shulchan Aruch, because I'm curious, did these anecdotes, the rules of these anecdotes, did it make it into the Shulchan Aruch? And the answer is yes. The Shulchan Aruch decides Jewish law according to these anecdotes, but the Shulchan Aruch does not acknowledge that at first the law was represented in one way, and then via the anecdote, the law got modified. The Shulchan Aruch will simply say, on Yom Kippur, no leather shoes, but of course, you can wear shoes made of other materials. It won't say, this was a change of the rule of the Mishnah. It won't say that. Okay. I hope that's the end.
Yeah, so you've shown certainly, very convincingly that these anecdotes represent changes in the earlier stated law. What proportion of them are changes toward leniency? Is one person's question. Can you detect a pattern there?
Oh, okay. That is the question. Yes, I'm very happy to answer that question, because not all of them, I will say roughly 3/4 of the anecdotes show changes in the direction of leniency. I can give you one example, very brief, about a direction towards stringency. A rabbi wanted to build himself a mansion with non-Jewish workers who could build on Shabbat. There are certain restrictions. I won't go into them now about how non-Jews can work for you on Shabbat. And he built himself this gorgeous mansion, and his colleagues would not step foot into it. They would not, when they visited him, they would not step foot in it. So they did not like the fact that the rabbi was utilizing that rule about using non-Jews on Shabbat to build your home. I confess I did not look this one up in the Shulchan Aruch yet, but chances are the Shulchan Aruch is going to go in the direction of the stringent visitors who wouldn't step foot in that brand new, beautiful mansion.
And the multiple anecdotes, are they arguing for the legitimacy of multiple solutions or multiple opinions, as it were, or are they simply different approaches to the same ruling or the same notion?
Yeah, well, that's a little bit more subjective. I'm going to say my theory is that when you have two or more, and I have, I don't know how many, 10 examples or so in my book, that they're showing you that there's more than one solution to the whatever the problem is. And that's not a problem. That you can change the earlier stated rule in this way or in this way or in that way. Yeah, I think that's what you were asking me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes, that's definitely what I think.
Okay.
Multiple solutions.
Now, on the last text, one of the listeners wants to know, her question is, weren't the streets filthy with waste? Right? So, of course, the rabbis needed something on their feet. They could have had small cuts, etc. So is this just a practical response to an unyielding law? Or, how do you interpret that?
That interpretation will definitely work for me. Let's put it this way. I saw in the Jerusalem Talmud, and all that is in the book too, and in the Babylonian Talmud, you saw 4 anecdotes. There are actually 6 anecdotes. In the Jerusalem Talmud, there's another 4 anecdotes, all of which move in the direction of you don't have to go out barefoot on this public fast day. And we're not given the reason, whether they were worried about stepping in refuse, whether they were worried about the impropriety of having their feet seen, whether it was safety concerns or comfort. We don't know. So your theory is just as good as mine. I do not know the archaeology of those ancient cities, but from what I've seen in Israel today, there's usually sewage running down the middle of the street, and that may be an ancient technique, and you could be right.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I have to tell you that I love that question. When I go to Shul on Yom Kippur, I of course wear my non-leather shoes on the way, but I'm always very careful to remove them when I arrive at the synagogue, because there, I'm safe. I have no reason to, to protect my feet, and it feels like the right thing to do to go back to the original practice.
I see. All right. Very interesting. The Talmud does say that if you're traveling, like walking on the road or something on a public fast day, or even on Yom Kippur, you may, I thought you were going to say this, David, but you said the opposite. If you're traveling on the road on Yom Kippur, it is permissible to wear shoes for safety. But when you get to town, you should remove those leather shoes of yours. Right.
Well, that's my way of doing that.
Okay.
What about, so one listener went back to the anecdote on music on Shabbat. I think you said this, but is it clear to you that this means musical instruments as such, or is it possible that there was a tradition of a broader prohibition?
Well, let's put it this way. You can certainly sing on Shabbat. We definitely have instances of rabbis singing on Shabbat. So what does lo asru ela kol shir? What else could kol shir mean? Elsewhere in Masechet Beitzah, they talk about lest you can't use an instrument on Shabbat, lest a string snaps and you're going to fix it on Shabbat. You're not supposed to fix things, Hashem yetaken, and so on. I'm happy to hear what another possibility would be, aside from singing and aside from musical instruments.
Yeah, no, I think that's what the questioner was referring to. It was a question of clarification. Now, how many, do you see these stories in general as examples of dealing with reality as opposed to the rules, which sometimes operate, in kind of this world of pure halachic decision-making without really relating to the reality in which they need to be applied?
Well, yes. What sometimes people say to me is, these anecdotes never took place. They're just made up in order to teach you whatever it is that they want to teach you. So my answer is, I can't say whether they actually took place or not, but in terms of the message that they're giving, whether they took place or not, the message that rabbis may modify halakhah is right there. But coming back to, did they happen or did they not happen? I'm basically on the side of, why couldn't they have happened? We're not talking about some miraculously event. We're not talking about Elijah the prophet showing up to anybody. That a rabbi put on reeds on his feet on Yom Kippur, that easily could have, it could be a real detail that his student saw and reported. Again, we will never know. We don't have much archaeological evidence, material evidence from this period of Jewish history, certainly not from Babylonia, more so from the land of Israel. But that's how I regard these. You want to look at them as educational, that they were, made up in order to fabricate it, in order to teach you that rabbis can change the law by acting differently from what the law states. Okay, you want to say that? You can say that. To me, it just, other words, I don't want to doubt that these episodes really took place unless I have a solid basis. Mm-hmm. Do any of them, the anecdotes that I'm talking about, have mystical elements or, magical travel elements? No. These are all, a man knocks on the door on the Sabbath and somebody else gets angry and somebody else criticizes the man who got angry. That can happen today. I will just say, by way of sort of comparison, although I see that Elisa Arts asked a question I want to try to answer. Many, many years ago, a friend of mine who was an Orthodox rabbi spent Shabbat in my home, which was also pretty amazing to me that he would do that. And I was washing some dishes in my kitchen using a sponge on Shabbat. And he said to me very nicely, which rabbi permitted you to use a sponge on Shabbat? So this is how it works. You know, that could have been an anecdote in the Talmud. Maybe it'll say in the Mishnah, lo l'schot, no squeezing water. There is a Mishnah like that. Right. Towels and bathing and don't squeeze out towels on Shabbat. Oh, Rabbi Hauptman washed her dishes with a sponge on Shabbat. She obviously thinks that using a sponge on Shabbat to wash dishes and squeezing it out is allowed. Okay, that's all I can say. These are such giveaway lines that could have happened. There was that question about for the good of the community. Yes, it is true that there are anecdotes in my book in which rabbis were actually prompted to make changes because the community wanted them to make those changes. So yes, you are right, Elisa, that does happen.
Great. Okay, thank you. Judy, you promised at the beginning, before everyone was logged on, that you begin on time. And the only reason you didn't was because I held us up for a couple of minutes. And then you said that, you know, you end on time too. So we want to respect your sensibility as a Rav. You also said at the beginning that people can find the book on the publisher's website. Someone I see has put that up in the chat. So folks, you can find that or wherever your favorite bookseller is. And more than anything else, thank you for teaching us Torah.
Okay. And I put my email address, I believe I did that, yes, on the, did I? Or did I not? Anyway, if you want to send me email, I see I didn't, but if you want to send me email, you can do that.
Someone just asked about that. Do you want to just spell out your email address?
Yes, it's JU, the first two letters, my first name, Hauptman, Hauptman, at jtsa.edu. If you Google my name, chances are you will get my email address. I really should have put it on the handout, but
no, that's great. Thank you for your generosity in that, and thank you for both teaching us and telling us about your book. Before our book talks, I often say that we feature important new Jewish books, and this is without question in that category. So we are very grateful to you.
But I also want to thank David Kramer because you were able to get me through your library connections a beautiful image for the cover. So JTS played a role here, and therefore JTS Library has the book. And if you're interested, you can read it and talk to me.
That's great. Okay. Thank you all, and have a good end of year season. Stay healthy, and we will see you with more book talks in January and February and beyond. Good night.
Good night.